There is kind of a myth around compressors saying that it turns everything louder. While it is kind of true in some situations, it is not really how a compressor works. In this video, we'll see exactly how a compressor works, what parameters you have to control it, and different kind of compressor you can find. A compressor is actually designed to make things sound quieter by turning down the volume of the loudest part of the sound. So the dynamic of the sound, which is the difference in volume between the loudest part and the quietest part, will be reduced. The dynamic will be compressed, hence the name compressor. And because quiet part of the sound will be closer to the loud parts in terms of volume, everything would sound closer to the ears. And it can also bring forward some details in the sound that would otherwise be in the background. So there are 5 parameters you can find on any compressor. The threshold, which is the point above which the sound will be compressed. If the sound is not loud enough to reach the threshold, then it won't be compressed. Then the ratio, which sets how much the sound will be compressed. The higher the ratio, the more compressed the sound. So for example, if a sound exceeds the threshold by 10 decibels and the ratio is at 2:1, then this excess will be divided by 2, so the sound will only peak at 5 dB above the threshold. If the ratio was set to 4:1, the sound will be compressed by a factor of 4, so it would peak at 2.5 decibel above the threshold. Then is the makeup gain or output gain, which allows you to make the overall sound louder to make up for the loss in volume due to the compression. Then there is the attack, which will set how fast the compressor will kick in after the signal passed the threshold. So with an attack at 0 millisecond, the sound would be compressed instantly, and with an attack at 100 millisecond, the compressor would go from 0 to full compression in 100 milliseconds after the signal reached the threshold. This is useful to let the transient of a sound go through before the compressor kicks in. We'll see that in a moment. And finally, the release, which tells you how fast the compressor falls back after the signal have returned below the threshold. So with a long release, the compressor will stay active for a little while. It can be hard to actually hear the effect of a compressor at first, so don't hesitate to crank up some knobs to get the other settings right before turning back down the first knobs you cranked up. For example, you can crank up the ratio and turn the threshold down to exaggerate the effect and hear it more easily. Then it can be easier to set the attack and the release to values that you like. Then turn the threshold back up to affect only the part of the sound you want to affect. And then turn the ratio back down to a more subtle value. And finally, you can turn up the makeup to taste. The thing is, when you compress a sound, it will fill the frequency spectrum more consistently, because the quiet elements of the sound will be brought up relatively to the loud elements, so the sound would appear thicker. This can be used to make an element cut through a mix, without making it actually louder, but it can also make it clash with other instruments in the mix, so there's a fine balance to find there. Now, let's see the effect of a compressor on a kick drum. Let's be a bit extreme with it so we can hear better what it does, so I'll put a high ratio and a low threshold. Now let's hear how the attack affects the kick drum. As you can hear, a very short attack actually makes the kick quite dull. It doesn't hit as hard. That's because with a short attack, the transient, so the very first part of the sound that is really high in energy, is brought down by the compressor. So to keep the energy of the kick, we need to let the transient through before the compressor kicks in. So with a longer attack, the transient have the time to go through before the rest of the sound is compressed. And then you want to adjust the release. It sets how long it takes to the sound to go back to normal volume once it went back under the threshold. It all depends on the tempo and the feel of the track, so it is easier to set this one in context with other instruments playing. Listen carefully, trust your ears, and stop when it feels good. So the rule of thumb to remember is that generally a long attack with a short release is good to keep the dynamic of a sound, so the transient have time to go through before the compressor kicks in, which preserves the energy of the sound, and a short attack with a long release is good to control the sound if you feel it needs to be more consistent. It is often a matter of finding the right balance between the two. Now this is the main principle of a compressor, but there are different kinds of compressors, or several ways to use them. You could use it as a parallel effect, which means you would split the signal in two tracks to have one channel that is processed by the compressor and one channel that is not. One way to do that is to use a return track. You put your compressor on the return track and then send your track to this return effect. This way the sound of your track will be layered with the effect in your return track. Another way to do that in Ableton Live is to create an effect track with two chains, one with no effect and one with a compressor. This way you would have your original sound that is doubled by its compressed version, which can be a good way to add beefiness to a sound, like a kick drum for example. You can apply a compressor to a group of tracks to affect several instruments together. This can help tie up those tracks together in a more cohesive ensemble. It can make it sound more like it's one block that is well held together. You could use group compression to glue all your drum tracks together, or all your lead tracks, or to glue your bass with the kick drum for example. This is more on the mixing side of things, but compressing a group of tracks can also highlight frequency issues. So use it in combination with an EQ on each track of the group, so you can avoid having frequencies on one track clashing with the same frequency range of another track. Compressors designed to be used on a group of tracks are often called glue compressors, but nothing prevents you from using a glue compressor on a single track or using a regular compressor on a group. They are all essentially the same thing. You could also split the signal into different bandwidths to have only the lows in one channel, only the mid in the second channel, and only the trebles in the third one. This way you could apply different compressions to each channel. Some compressors have this split channel system already built in. They are called multiband compressors. They work like several compressors, one by frequency band, and usually they let you set the split point between two bands where you want. So they are very handy to have more control over your compression if you need that level of precision. OTT is a particular preset that got so popular I thought I needed to include it here. OTT stands for over the top, and it was originally a preset for Ableton's multiband compressor. But then it got so popular that it's been made as a free third-party VST plugin by Xfer, the guys who made Serum. And it's really weird because it really squashes the audio like there's no tomorrow, which would be a bad idea in a lot of contexts. If you do that on every track, it will feel like you brought every sound closer to your ears, and every sound would be competing against each other. That would end up in a very messy mix. But in the phase of sound design, you can use it like a magnifier to reveal all the textures of the sound that is normally in the background. Because it compresses the lows, the mids and the trebles independently, and it compresses them so much, everything will be brought up to the same level. And in some music genres, it's become a common practice to put several in a row if you really want to squash that sound. So in the end, it's a very nice thing to try out. And then you can filter out some frequencies afterward because it will really push up all the frequencies in the spectrum. I think it works better on synth sounds than recorded samples, because with a recording it will really reveal and bring up all the background noises. On the OTT, the main parameters would be the time knob, which acts a bit like a combination of attack and release, and the amount knob, which acts a bit like between a general ratio and a dry-wet. The amount knob is not really a dry-wet though. If you put several OTTs in a row with an amount of 0, you will still hear a transformation in the sound. I think it is due to the way the multiband compressor separates each band of frequency, but anyway, that's still a cool thing to try. And then you have the level of each band that you can use as a small EQ. The OTT in the particular case, it's not for all sounds, but it's very popular, so we'll probably talk about it again. Another way to use a compressor that is very popular in electronic music is to use it in sidechain. When a compressor is set to sidechain, it takes an external signal as an input, and then it is this external signal that will trigger the compressor. The most common application is to put a compressor on the bass and put the kick track in the sidechain input. So every time the kick plays, it will trigger the compressor, which will compress the bass. So the bass will duck every time the kick plays, creating a pumping effect. Personally, I usually prefer to use an extra track dedicated to trigger those sidechain compressors. Basically, I would create a MIDI track and create a synth that makes a very clicky sound by turning down its envelope's attack, sustain and release, and then setting a very short decay. It's very easy, the kick is already played by a MIDI instrument, so you just have to duplicate this MIDI track, and then I mute this new MIDI track and use it to trigger my sidechain compressor. Because the sound of this synth is so short, it's easier to make the release synced to the tempo. You would put the attack very low so the compressor engages right away when it receives the click, and then the release sets how long it takes to the bass to come back at normal level. So if you want that time to be of a quarter note, just take 60,000, which is the number of milliseconds in a minute, and divide it by a tempo, which is the number of quarter note in a minute. It will give you the time for one quarter note, which you can put as the release time. This way you can have a sidechain compression synced to your tempo. Another way to mimic that in Ableton for a 4-to-the-floor rhythm that I find cleaner sometimes is to put an auto pan effect. It's a panning effect, but if you put the phase at 0, sync it to the tempo and use the reverse sawtooth waveform, you can mimic the pumping effect. Then you can play with the shape knob to change the way the bass is coming back up. Here I'm showing it with a bass and a kick, but it can help in a mix for any instrument to set priorities. For example, you can duck some tracks down when the singer's voice is coming in. A compressor can also be used as a de-esser, which can reduce the sibilances of a voice recording. It's used to reduce the level of the sir and sh sounds. To do that, you need some kind of multiband compressor to compress only the frequencies where the sibilances live. Usually the sh sounds are around 5000 to 6000 Hz, and the s sounds are usually around 7000 to 9000 Hz. 7000 to 9000 Hz. 7000 to 9000 Hz. In Ableton's regular compressor, when you open the sidechain with this little arrow, you also have access to an EQ section. There, you can select a bandpass mode, so only a band of frequency will trigger the compressor. This is how the de-esser preset has been built. But if only the sibilances will trigger the compressor, it's the whole sound that will be compressed, but it is still a good way to lower some of the harsh parts of the sound. A limiter is usually identified as a separate effect, but it works in a very similar way than a compressor. If you crank the ratio of a compressor all the way up until it says infinite ratio, you have what is called a brick wall compressor. This way, no sound would go past the threshold because any sound that would go past it would be brought down at the threshold level. And this is exactly what a limiter does. It prevents anything from going higher than a certain level. Usually, it is used on a track or on the master bus with the threshold at 0 dB to make sure you don't get any clipping. Overall, a compressor will reduce the dynamic of a sound while bringing it closer to the ears of the listener. Maybe this video was more on the mixing side than actual sound design, but I hope it's been useful to some of you. Compressor is kind of a mysterious effect. You hear a lot about it, but it's kind of hard to actually hear what it does. Or at least that's something I struggled a lot with when I was starting out. So have fun with your mixes and sound design. If you want to help out the channel, you can like, subscribe, comment the video, and more importantly share it to your friends, all the usual. That's all for today. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you all next time.